He knows what happened during that window. The question the investigation is building toward is whether the evidence, when it's complete, can prove it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What does the behavioral pattern tell you? Do you think the timeline adjustment was a genuine correction or something else? And what do you think investigators find when the Phoenix identification comes back? Subscribe. This case is not finished. The next update is going to matter. Not resolved. Moving. There's a difference. And in true crime cases, the ones that move are the ones that eventually arrive somewhere. The ones that roll the board. The question this case leaves open, the one that the interrogation details sharpen but don't resolve, is a simple one. What happened during the window the cameras captured? The footage shows movement near the side of the house. Tomaso's timeline in its earliest version.
There are moments in a missing person case when the evidence does not shout. It shifts. Quietly. A timestamp moves. A camera frame gets reviewed again. A witness changes a detail. A pause in an interview lasts longer than it should. And suddenly, what once looked like an open mystery begins to form a shape. That is what appears to be happening in the Nancy Guthrie case. For weeks, the case sat in the same painful space, an 84-year-old woman missing from her home, unanswered questions, family pressure, neighborhood fear, and investigators trying to understand how someone like Nancy could vanish without leaving behind a clear explanation. But according to the narrative now surrounding the investigation, one piece of evidence has started to change the way everything is being read. Not a confession. Not an arrest. Not a clean video showing exactly what happened. Something much more frustrating. A partial CCTV capture. Movement near the side of the house. A window of time that matters. And a timeline from Tomaso Chioni that, according to the discussion around the case, did not stay exactly where it first started. That is where this story begins. Not with a final answer. With a window. A narrow window of time. The kind of window investigators build cases around. Nancy Guthrie lived in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. She was 84 years old. A retired school teacher. A woman described as steady, familiar, and rooted in her routines. She was not known as someone who disappeared. She was not someone who could easily vanish without help. She had limited mobility. She did not drive long distances. She did not simply walk off into the night. And yet, she was gone. From her own home. Without her phone. Without her belongings. Without a clear sign that she packed, planned, or intended to leave. That is what made the case feel wrong from the beginning. When an elderly woman disappears from a familiar home, investigators do not only ask where she went. They ask how she left. Did she leave willingly? Was she helped? Was she forced? Did she know the person at the door? Did someone come through a side entrance? Did someone understand the property well enough to avoid being seen? And most importantly, who was close enough to Nancy that their presence would not have alarmed her? That is where Tomaso Chioni enters the broader timeline. He was not a stranger to Nancy's world. He was connected through family. He was familiar with the home, familiar with Nancy, familiar with the rhythms of the property in a way an outsider may not have been. That does not make him guilty. That does not prove involvement. It simply explains why investigators would need his timeline to be clear, precise, and consistent. Because when someone is close to the last known window of a missing person's life, their account becomes more than a statement. It becomes part of the map. Where were you? When did you arrive? When did you leave? Who saw you? What did you notice? What did Nancy say? Was anything unusual? Did you go near the side of the house? Did you return? Did your vehicle move? Did your phone move? Did your story stay the same after investigators showed you evidence? Those are the questions that turn a person's timeline into something law enforcement can test. At first, according to the account being discussed, the surveillance review did not give investigators what they wanted. That happens more often than people realize. Most home security footage is not clean and cinematic. It does not always show a face. It does not always show a vehicle. It does not always capture the full movement. Sometimes the camera catches the edge of something. A shape. A shadow. A partial movement. A person passing through the corner of the frame. A motion-triggered recording that starts too late or ends too soon. And in the early stages of an investigation, when detectives are looking for something obvious, those partial moments can be missed or labeled inconclusive. But inconclusive does not mean useless. It means unfinished. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, the reanalysis of that footage may be one of the most important parts of the story. Because when investigators reportedly went back and reviewed the footage again, slower, frame by frame, timestamp by timestamp, they noticed movement near the side of the house during a window that mattered. Not a clean identification. Not a clear face. Not a license plate. But movement. Enough movement to create a question. Who was there? And when? That question matters because Tomaso's earlier timeline reportedly placed him gone before that movement was captured. That is the center of the issue. If Tomaso had already left, then the movement near the side of the house may belong to someone else. But if Tomaso was still there, or if his departure happened closer to that window than he first stated, then investigators have to ask why the first version did not match the later evidence. That does not automatically mean deception. Memory can be imperfect. People can misremember time. A person may think they left at 1 hour when it was actually later. Stress, routine, and the passage of days can blur details. A difference of 20 or 30 minutes can happen honestly. But in a serious missing person investigation, an adjusted timeline is never ignored. Especially when the adjustment happens after investigators introduce evidence. That is where the phrase, post-evidence alignment, becomes important. Post-evidence alignment means a person's story begins to shift after they learn what investigators have. The shift may be innocent. It may be a genuine correction. But it may also be strategic. A person may adjust only enough to reduce the conflict between their original statement and the evidence now placed in front of them. That is why investigators do not look only at the words. They look at how the words arrive. Did the person seem surprised? Did they say, "Wait, I thought I left earlier, but maybe I got the time wrong"? Did they show confusion? Did they add new detail naturally? Did the memory open up? Or did the answer become smaller? More careful? More controlled? Less spontaneous? Those differences matter. Because real memory usually expands when prompted. A person remembers one thing, then another. They may say, "Actually, yes, I remember now. I checked my phone. I went back for my keys. I spoke to Nancy again. That is why I was still there." That is how genuine recall often works. But when a person repeats the same core answer with slightly different wording and no new detail, investigators may read that differently. Not as proof. The thing about a timeline is that it does not need to accuse anyone. It only needs to hold still. A person can explain. A person can forget. A person can correct themselves. A person can say they were nervous, confused, tired, misunderstood, or unsure of the exact hour. But a timeline is different. It waits. It sits beside camera footage. It sits beside phone records. It sits beside vehicle movement. It sits beside interview transcripts. And slowly, it asks one question. Does the story still fit? That is the pressure now surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case. Because according to the account being discussed, the investigation did not suddenly change because of one dramatic confession. It changed because a timeline began rubbing against evidence. A camera saw movement near the side of Nancy's property. Tomaso Chioni's earlier account placed him gone before that window. Then, after investigators reportedly confronted him with the footage analysis, the timeline shifted closer to the window. That does not automatically prove guilt. But it creates pressure. And in serious investigations, pressure is where the case begins to speak. The central question is not simply whether Tomaso remembered the time incorrectly. That is possible. People misremember time all the time. Especially in stressful situations. Someone may think they left at 9:30 when it was actually closer to 10. Someone may believe they were gone before a camera window when they were still on the property. Human memory is not a clock. But investigators are not only studying the corrected time. They are studying the way the correction happened. Did it come naturally? Did it come before the evidence was shown? Did it include fresh details that made the memory feel real? Did it arrive with surprise? Did he say, "Wait, I must have been wrong. I remember now because this happened right before I left"? Or did the adjustment arrive only after the footage created a problem? That difference matters. A genuine correction often opens the memory. A strategic adjustment often narrows it. A person genuinely remembering may add details. A person aligning with evidence may simply move the timeline just enough to survive the contradiction. That is why investigators pay attention to what is sometimes called post-evidence alignment. A story changes after the evidence appears. Not enough to collapse the original account. Not enough to admit anything directly. Just enough to fit better. That is the uncomfortable space this case appears to be entering. Because if Tomaso's original timeline was honest but wrong, then the updated version should help explain the night more clearly. But if the updated version only appeared after investigators showed him that the first version had a problem, then investigators have to ask why. Was he remembering? Or was he adjusting? Was he helping? Or was he managing? That word, managing, becomes important. Because the behavioral pattern described in the source material is not about one dramatic moment. It is not about a single nervous glance. It is not about one pause. It is not about one folded hand. It is about clustering. The same kind of behavioral shift reportedly appearing around the same subject matter. The CCTV window. The movement near the side of the house. The gap between the earlier statement and the evidence. When questions stayed broad, the answers reportedly moved more smoothly. When the questions narrowed, the rhythm changed. The pauses got longer. The answers became smaller. The phrasing became more careful. The same core statement was reportedly repeated without much new detail. And the timeline began to shift toward the evidence. Again, none of that is proof on its own. An innocent person can be nervous. An innocent person can pause. An innocent person can sound careful when questioned by investigators. But investigators do not look at behavior alone. They look at behavior next to evidence. That is the point. Behavior by itself can mislead. Evidence by itself can be incomplete. But when behavior changes precisely where evidence creates pressure, investigators pay attention. That is why the interrogation structure matters. They start wide. They let the person tell the story. They do not challenge everything immediately. They do not show the strongest evidence too early. They let the person build their own version. That version becomes the baseline. Then the questions get tighter. Not, "What did you do that night?" But, "Where were you at this exact time?" Not, "When did you leave?" But, "Can you account for this window?" Not, "Did you notice anything unusual?" But, "Why does the footage show movement near the side of the house during the period your timeline says you were already gone?" That is when the interview changes. That is when a prepared story begins to feel pressure. And that is when investigators watch closely. They are not only listening for words. They are listening for friction. Does the story flow naturally into the new facts? Or does it start resisting them? Does the person expand with detail? Or retreat into repetition? Does the person become confused in a way that feels natural? Or careful in a way that feels protective? That is what appears to have made Tomaso's questioning important. Because according to the narrative, investigators were not reading his behavior in isolation. They were reading it beside the footage. The footage showed movement. The first timeline placed him gone. The later timeline moved him closer. And the behavioral changes reportedly appeared when that exact issue became the focus. Those details now sit together. And once they sit together, the case begins to move. That does not mean investigators have reached the end. It means they now have a direction. The direction is the window. The side of the house. The camera's edge. The incomplete recording. The moment where the system captured something but not enough to answer everything. That is one of the most frustrating parts of modern surveillance. People assume cameras solve cases. Sometimes they do. But often, cameras only create sharper questions. They capture a shadow. A shape. A movement at the edge. A person leaving the sensor range. A figure too blurry to identify. A vehicle too far away to read. A gap where the recording ends before the truth arrives. And yet, those imperfect images can still matter. Because the camera does not need to show everything. It only needs to contradict something. If footage places movement where a person says there should have been none, that matters. If the timestamp places activity after someone says they left, that matters. The final question in this case is not whether the timeline looks uncomfortable. It does. The final question is not whether the behavior during questioning raised concern. It did. The final question is not whether the CCTV reanalysis changed the way investigators read the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. It clearly appears to have done that. The final question is whether all of it can be proven. Because in a missing person investigation, suspicion can move quickly. Evidence moves slower. And proof moves slowest of all. That is the place where the Nancy Guthrie case now appears to stand. Not finished. Not cold. Not solved. But moving through the difficult space between what investigators may believe and what they can establish with evidence strong enough to hold. That distinction matters. A camera window can create pressure. An adjusted timeline can raise questions. A behavioral pattern can help investigators understand where stress appears. A family accusation can reveal tension inside the circle. A possible Phoenix connection can widen the geography of the case. But none of those things alone is enough. A case like this cannot be built on one strange pause. It cannot be built on one changed answer. It cannot be built on one partial camera frame. It cannot be built on internet suspicion. It has to be built on convergence. That is the word that matters now. Convergence. Different kinds of evidence pointing toward the same truth. The footage. The timeline. The phone records. The vehicle data. The movement patterns. The Phoenix identification. The family statements. The forensic testing. The physical evidence. The behavioral observations. The route between Tucson and Phoenix. All of those pieces have to be tested against each other. If they point in different directions, the case remains complicated. If they begin pointing in the same direction, the case changes. And that may be why investigators are paying such close attention to the window captured on CCTV. Because sometimes the most important part of a case is not the long story. It is the narrowest part. One time frame. One movement. One statement. One adjustment. One contradiction that cannot be comfortably explained away. The movement near the side of the house is not enough by itself. It does not show a clear face. It does not give the public a name. It does not tell us exactly what happened before or after. But it creates a point of pressure because it exists inside the same window as the timeline problem. That is why investigators would keep returning to it. Who was there? Why was that person near the side of the property? Was the movement connected to Nancy? Was it connected to someone familiar with the house? Was it connected to an exit route? Was it connected to the reason Nancy vanished without her phone or belongings? And most importantly, why did Tomaso's timeline reportedly move closer to that window only after investigators introduced the footage analysis? That is the question that will not disappear. Because if his adjusted timeline was a genuine correction, then investigators have to prove that it fits naturally. They have to see whether his new version aligns with phone data, vehicle movement, witness accounts, and other evidence. But if the adjustment was strategic, then the case becomes more serious. A strategic adjustment suggests the person was not simply remembering. They were navigating. They were trying to move around the evidence without fully colliding with it. And that is what investigators would be looking for in every later interview. Does the story become clearer? Or does it stay small? Does the person add natural details? Or do they keep repeating the same careful claim? Does the timeline open? Or does it stay protected around the exact point where the evidence creates pressure? Those are not small differences. They are the difference between memory and management. And that difference is why interrogation details matter. Not because body language is magic. It is not. Not because folded hands prove guilt. They do not. Not because reduced eye contact automatically means deception. It does not. But when the same subject produces the same pattern of stress again and again, investigators listen. They listen to the timing of the pause. They listen to the wording. They listen to whether the answer grows with detail or shrinks with control. They listen to whether the person sounds like they are searching memory or protecting a boundary. And in the narrative surrounding this case, the boundary appears to be the same every time. The CCTV window. That is the center. The footage did not reveal everything. But it revealed enough to make the earlier timeline unstable. And once a timeline becomes unstable, investigators begin testing everything around it. That testing may now be moving beyond the house. Because the Phoenix thread creates a second layer of pressure. Tucson to Phoenix is a real distance. Not impossible. Not casual either. A vehicle could make that trip at night under the right circumstances. But the question is not whether the trip could happen. The question is whether evidence shows that it did. That is what investigators would have to determine. Did a phone connect to towers along Interstate 10? Did any vehicle connected to the timeline show movement in that direction? Were there fuel purchases? Traffic cameras? License plate reader hits? Receipts? GPS fragments? App activity? Vehicle telematics? Physical evidence inside a car? Soil, fibers, biological traces, or cleaning signs? Those are the things that can turn a theory into a map. And if the unidentified person found near the Grand Canal Trail in Phoenix is confirmed not to be Nancy, then that thread may change direction. The case would still remain open. Investigators would still have the CCTV window. They would still have the adjusted timeline. They would still have the behavioral pattern. They would still have the question of how an 84-year-old woman disappeared from her home. But the Phoenix pressure would shift. It would no longer be a possible final destination. It might become a false lead. Or it might become irrelevant. That is why identification matters so much. If Phoenix does not connect, investigators have to keep asking where Nancy is. But if Phoenix does connect, the case changes categories. It becomes heavier. The timeline becomes more urgent. The route becomes more important. The vehicle question becomes more central. The adjusted departure time becomes more significant.